Really? I gotta buy one of these things? Welcome to Lancaster Hi-Fi. I'm Stephen Lancaster, and yes, I got a band-aid on my forehead. It's not an interesting story, so whatever explanation story you want to come up with to explain the band-aid, it's going to be more interesting than what actually happened. You'll hear on a lot of YouTube videos that any external phono preamp is going to be better than the one contained in whatever integrated unit you're dealing with, whether that's the phono preamp in a vintage amp or receiver, or the phono preamp in a modern turntable. But you're thinking, I know you're thinking, because I'm thinking it, oh, come on. I mean, I know like an AT60, whatever, you know, some basic toy of a modern turntable is going to have a crap phono preamp in it. But surely my old vintage stuff, especially if I've, you know, overhauled it or restored it or had it worked on, surely its phono preamp is going to be pretty top notch. I mean, at least competitive with, you know, something like an i5, iPhono 2, or an E8R 834 clone. Surely if I've got an old vintage integrated tube amp or a late 70s integrated amp, or hell, if I've got some nice phase linear separates, or maybe even a Sanyo era Fisher Studio Select Studio Select control amp, you know, surely, you know, those are going to have decent phono preamps in them, and I'm not going to need to get something like this or this in order to get decent sound from my records. Quite a legitimate question, I would say, and a legitimate expectation that some of this old gear must have had really good phono preamps in it, because, you know, records were what people listened to. And so if they're trying to sell a sound of an amp, then, you know, largely they're also trying to sell the sound of their phono preamp. So they can't be crap, right? Well, I don't know. I've never had one of these old phono preamps sound like total crap. I don't think. But I don't know. I mean, I've never compared them side by side with, you know, these separate phono preamps. I mean, these just weren't a thing back in the day, really. At least not to my memory. Well, I don't know. Let's give it a try. I've got Heavy Weather by Weather Report here. Decent cartridge. Turntable's so-so. And I got a selection of gear with phono preamps in it. This Fisher CC3000 control amplifier. It's a preamp, and it's got, I mean, hell, this thing has a moving coil stage in it even. I mean, we'll just be using the moving magnet today, but the moving magnet stage has selectable different input impedances. I've got this Phase Linear 2000. I mean, surely it's got a pretty decent phono preamp in it. I can report, having looked inside, it's an op-amp based circuit though. So I don't know if that's good or bad, really. Hell, I've got a tube phono preamp in this Payco SA40. I've kind of trimmed the values of the phono preamp components in there, so surely it's good. And this Kenwood KA9100, man, I've worked on it. You know, I'd say the amp in general isn't in perfect, like, or optimal, or at least, you know, I'd like it to sound better, but, you know, I have worked on the phono preamp. I've at least got it working, and surely it's decent. I mean, this is a pretty high-end integrated amp in its day. How does some of this sound? Relative to David Clayton's EAR 834 clone, or the iFi iPhono 2. And I could compare against, you know, a third one, but I figured I'd have a tube stage to compare with the old tube stage, and I'd have a solid state stage to compare against the solid state stages. And let's just see. I mean, I don't know. I don't know what to expect, whether these are going to sound much better than the rest of them. Let's explore and, just deal with this question of like, oh, come on, really? Really, do I need to get an external phono preamp if I want decent sound from my records? If you're like me, you've pretty much been satisfied with the phono preamp stages already in your gear, and you haven't really thought of getting one of these unless, you moved up to, say, a moving coil cartridge and found that, oh, well, I can't use the moving magnet stages in this gear that I already have. Now, that's not true of this one. This has a moving coil stage, and I actually modified it, so surely it's good enough. I don't know. I will tell you that when I went from this to this with my Riga Atheta moving coil cartridge, it seemed like this sounded a lot better. But I didn't do an A-B comparison either, because most people don't have a test rig like this one. Even with a test rig like this one, I can't just press a button and switch. So, I still got to reconnect wires and whatnot in order to do the A-B comparison. But at least, we can sit in the same spot and not have to actually move gear around in order to do the test. Got my JBL studio monitors back there, or control monitors, whatever. 4411s. Decent speakers. I've just laid out a selection here. I've got others, but this seemed like, 60s, 70s, probably 80s, 70s. So, let's check it out. Now we're going to try the EAR 834 clone through the Phono SA40. So my first impression is that the EAR 834 was a pretty dramatic improvement over the onboard phono preamp in the Phono SA40. That if we were listening to the Phono SA40 by itself on its own initially and thinking, man, that's not a very nice amp, that the EAR 834 phono stage made it sound like a nice amp. At the beginning of the track, or near the beginning of the track with the integrated phono stage, I was wanting to groove to the music and then sort of having to go, that doesn't really sound very good, actually. Maybe it'll get better as it goes along. But with the external phono stage, it just sounded really nice all the way through. I'd say that answers the question for our old integrated tube amp, that the external phono stage is a pretty big improvement. Not just a big improvement, but I would say that the EAR 834 clone in this case makes records actually enjoyable at a relatively high listening volume. Whereas with the integrated phono stage, it's just kind of like, that's a little harsh. And you get used to it, but it's kind of harsh. So there's one question answered. I'm not saying that that's in all cases the case, right? That all integrated tube amps have crappy phono stages, or all vintage tube receivers have crappy phono stages. Not saying that at all. I'm just saying in this particular case, it was a pretty dramatic improvement. Well, let's move on to some solid state, shall we? Now we'll go through the hi-fi. So this was more subtle. Well, with the hi-fi, I just got a sense of overall better, like all the music being present rather than some of it not so much. When those horns come in first, you know, they do sound a bit harsh. And that harshness was greater with the integrated phono than it was with the hi-fi. It was still a bit harsh with the hi-fi, so I may just be wanting the hi-fi to sound better. I don't know. Maybe you can be the judge. When the full range of frequencies of all the instruments comes in, there's just a sense of wow with the hi-fi that still exists with the integrated phono in the Kenwood, but not the same wow. Like, wow, that's pretty cool, but with the hi-fi, it's like, oh, wow. And there's an objective measure for you, the oh, wow factor. You know, I don't think with the Kenwood you'd be doing terribly with the onboard Phono Preamp. You know, I think with the Payco, for example, you would kind of be doing a bit terribly with the onboard Phono Preamp, which is unfortunate because it's a tube stage. Seems like it could be better. And maybe I should try to make it better. I don't know if I think it's worth the effort. But the Kenwood, you know, I think it sounded pretty good. It's just, you know, the hi-fi is better. It's a better Phono Preamp still. And it kind of should be, right? The hi-fi on its own new, say the iPhone 03 new, would cost you about as much as the Kenwood would today. So, you know, it better sound better. All right. Well, I'm going to move on to some more gear. Let's check it out. All right, now we're going to try the phase linear with the iPhono. I'm not real sure about the differences between the hi-fi and the internal preamp on the phase linear. The difference wasn't as obvious to me on those, and it's Maybe interesting that the phase linear has an op-amp based phono preamp, whereas the Kenwood has discrete components. You know, some people don't like op amps, but I feel like they don't like them on principle more than real issues, because op amps are kind of awesome. You know, I don't have a problem with op amps. That one sounded good. I went back and forth a little bit, off camera. Its phono preamp sounded pretty good. And I couldn't really, say that there was a dramatic difference between it and the iFi. Maybe the iFi sounded better. I don't know. So that's kind of interesting. You know, maybe that's just Phase Linear living up to a certain reputation of making quality gear, making really hi-fi gear. So there you go. Well, we've got one more preamp to test. We've got the Fisher CC3000 control amplifier. All right, now we're going to use the Studio Standard by Fisher stereo control amplifier, model CC3000, and we're feeding the Phase Linear 200 power amp. And first, of course, we're going to use its Phono 1, which is a moving magnet stage set at 47K. Alrighty, now we've got turntable plugged into the iFi, setting to aux, and let's go. I think the iFi edged out the Fisher. I think it was a bit more than edged. It's a pretty dense arrangement towards the end there. And it sounded pretty cluttered and a bit muddy with the Fisher. And it never really went muddy with the iFi, I think. You know, audio memory isn't great, so that's my impression. And it's interesting, I think, especially with the Fisher, because the Fisher is one that you might buy, especially for its phono preamp and its features in its phono preamp, in that it's got 3 phono inputs, 1 moving coil and 2 moving magnets. So you could hook up 3 turntables to the Fisher. And I think, you know, if you chose to go that route, it's not a bad choice. But I think the iFi is still a better phono preamp. And it kind of ought to be. I mean, the Sanyo Fisher stuff doesn't have the greatest reputation. I think some of the studio standard stuff is pretty good. In particular, I like this preamp. It's pretty good. But it's hard to beat the iFi. You know, it's a really good phono preamp. It's edged out just about everything here that I've compared. So, let's go wrap it up. So, should you buy a separate phono preamp? I'd say generally, yeah. Yeah, generally you should. Although there may be specific cases where the built-in phono preamps are particularly good. Among the gear that I tested today, it seemed like the Phase Linear had a pretty good phono preamp. At least that was my impression. It wasn't particularly close with the Phono tube integrated amp. Wasn't particularly close with the Kenwood integrated amp. It was maybe a bit closer with the Fisher preamp, and closest, I'd say, with the Phase Linear 2000. And of course, I compared solid state to solid state and tube to tube. In my previous video, I compared the iFi and the 834, the solid state and the tube stages. And in that comparison, the iPhono came out ahead, but not dramatically ahead. The EAR 834 clone has a bit tubier, or sort of classically tubier sound. Not that it necessarily needs to, but it has a bit bigger bass and is a bit muddier in that bass. The iFi is just sort of delivers straightforwardly, accurately on all through the whole range, I think. But, this video is less about, which is the best Phono preamp, and, let's take good Phono preamps, both tubes and solid state, and compare them against what ought to be good integrated Phono stages. Some of those integrated Phono stages don't come out looking so great. Now, I say ought to be good. I don't know if we'd say that the Phono Phono stage ought to be all that good. That's a decent Phono preamp. I shouldn't rag on it too hard. But it doesn't perform particularly well compared to some other tube amps that I have and that I've built. That said, it sounds pretty good. It sounded great, actually, with the tube Phono stage, the EAR 834 tube Phono stage. It sounded great. I was actually pretty surprised how good it sounded. Led me to thinking, wow, the degree to which I don't think that integrated amp sounds all that great seems to have more to do with its Phono stage than anything else. It would seem to be then that if you've got a system where you're not super psyched about the sound of your records, an external Phono stage might really be the key for you. That's at least the result that's coming out of the tests I did today. And I will say that when I compared a bunch of Phono preamps in a video quite a while ago, years ago now, but, doing pretty rigorous frequency response measurements, the Fisher came out looking pretty good among those. And that was in comparison to, internal Phono stages within a Sansui 2000A, I think the Marantz 2252, among others. I think the NAD 701, that one came out looking pretty good too. The Adcom GTP 545 or 555, whichever it is, that came out looking pretty good. And the Fisher came out looking pretty good. And the Riga, my Riga Phono Mini came out looking pretty good. The iPhono 2 wasn't in those tests, nor was the EAR 834. And I think both of those pretty much better than any of the ones that I tested in that video. Yeah. They ought to be. They ought to be better. I mean, the iPhono 3, the current model, goes for $1,000 on its own. So it ought to be pretty damn good. Obviously, you can spend, say, $10,000 on a Mola Mola Lupe and do that much better. Now, is it 10 times as good? If the $10,000 isn't such a big deal for you, yeah, it's that much better. But don't worry, if you can't afford a Mola Mola Lupe, the iPhone 02 or iPhone 03 is damn good, and you'll be damn happy with it. Because if you can't afford a Mola Mola Loop, you also can't afford the amps that really make it shine, just to be clear, or speakers for that matter. So, it's all within context, right? But, in my test rig, we're listening to some vintage JBL monitors, and we're listening to vintage amps. Through that gear, the external phono preamps were able to shine and do their thing and make an improvement. And so, if you're wanting to improve the sound of your records, I think evidence shows, and it is sort of common wisdom, that an external phono preamp is going to be an improvement. Now, these are both really good phono preamps, external phono preamps. If we were comparing it against the Riga Phono Mini, the results might not be so clear. But I wanted to test against some really good phono preamps. Again, not the $10,000 phono preamps, but sort of the $1,000-ish and maybe a bit less phono preamps. And in that, yeah, I mean, they ought to do better, and they do. All right, I think I'm rambling now. I think I'm just repeating myself. So let's cut it off here and wrap it up. Yeah, you should buy an external phono stage. It'll make a difference. I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you got something out of it. If you did, please give it a thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel. Leave me a comment. Share the video. Tickle the algorithm. Help me grow my channel. Be awesome. And I will talk to you later. Cheers.